Everybody, let's see, Jim, here you go. You're on the flyer, so you should get one. All right, so, hey, come on in. So I think everybody's probably still in shock from the budget proposal. 134 million, 155 million, 41 higher percent cut from general fund for the University of Alaska, which would be detrimental to our state university. There have been some false numbers floating around there. It's only 17% cut, these kinds of things. Those are illusory, mismanaged, miscalculated figures. If you want to know more about that, attend at 4 p.m. today the Chancellor's Budget Assembly in the lecture hall for students. And if you have more questions about the data and stuff. What we want to do today is just really help mobilize students to tell their stories, mobilize you to be more informed so that you don't feel alienated from the process, which is why we're going to have Glenn introduce the budget process to us. We got a great template here for how to give your testimony, how to give your story with your legislature. I printed up 60 copies of these, probably between our 10 and 11 a.m. session. I'll go get more. Feel free to give these out to your friends and family members, especially if you are not from Juneau. If you're not registered to vote in Juneau, reach out to your family and your friends and your community to advocate. The Juneau legislative delegation is already very sympathetic toward the university, so we really need folks to reach out beyond Juneau. This is it's an emergency, right? I mean, this is a dire, urgent, critical matter. Hey, Kevin. Just don't let anybody tell you that this is not as bad as it could potentially be. This is no moment here to be indifferent, no moment to feel alienated. Everybody needs to get out. If you want the university to continue in any rich, meaningful, robust way, it's time to contact your legislators. And so the agenda we have today then is Glenn will talk about an intro to the budget process, and then I'll hand out this legislative advocacy template. I got this from Terry Tibbett, whose job for the Alaska Mental Health Institute. Is that who she works for?
That sounds right to me.
But her job is to train people for legislative advocacy, and I've taken a couple of her classes. And then Emily and Ernestine are here, is our brilliant storytellers, because if you're going to tell your story to the legislature in a meaningful way, it's good to gain a good sense of how to tell a vivid and compelling story. And then, depending on how everybody is feeling in the interim, we might encourage people to start filling out their stories right now here in this classroom, and then you can be able to share those perhaps with each other. Hey, come on in. This is legislative advocacy training. And then if we have time or if there's desire, we can talk about with Glenn effective ways of the protocol for giving your testimony. It really helps if you can go down to the Capitol, sit in those rooms, and tell your story. Be a body in those rooms. There's a certain protocol you'll want to follow. So we can just kind of run through that as well. Yeah. Before we get started with Glenn, I do want to say that we've already organized a second session. This will update us on the budget process. And again, we'll have a legislative advocacy component to that. And that's going to be on March 22nd, the Friday after spring break. And that's going to be run by Dr. Jim Powell from Business and Public Administration. You want to raise your hand in case you don't know Dr. Jim Powell. Dr. Kevin Meyer over there from English and Geography. And Dr. Rosemary Alexander back there. I don't know if you know, I put you on this list, but you're on this list. You were voluntold. Somebody said, put Rosemary on there. It's okay. Who not only teaches communication, but has a long, rich background in journalism. So has a lot to offer here as well. Before we get started, can we just go around and say our names? Is that helpful? I mean, if we're gonna mobilize on behalf of the university, we should know each other's names.
I'm Andrew.
Matt.
My name is Kit.
Kevin.
Cass.
Neely.
Katie Jordan, marketing, social media. So I'm recording this and hopefully putting it out. So feel free to share with any of your peers that aren't here.
Awesome, thank you.
Christine.
Ezra. Lars.
Sage. Kieran. Jim.
Lee. Rosemary.
All right, thank you. Oh, Kevin, yeah. Fantastic. All right, well, why don't you go ahead and give us a start here, Glenn?
Yeah, so let me just sort of lead on to what Saul was saying a minute ago about the budget numbers. You know, the state budget could be more complicated. I mean, like that sounds facetious when I say that like out loud, but it could be. We could be a bigger state, right? We could be the federal government, and there are some things that are built into the Alaska State Constitution that make our state government budget a lot simpler than comparable budgets and budgeting processes in other states. Nevertheless, the state of Alaska's budget is big. If you include federal transfer dollars and everything, it's something like $12 billion. It's a big chunk of change, right? And it's broken up into a lot of pieces, and this kind of creates opportunities for people to interpret that data in a variety of ways. And so I just want to reflect a little bit on what Saul said about those overall budget numbers and what they might mean for you guys. The budget proposal that's been put forth by the Dunleavy administration, if you look at the top line numbers, it does in fact call for something like a 17.7% reduction in the University of Alaska's total budget. And so that's bad. I mean, so one of the things that people have been saying is, oh, it's not 40%, it's only 18%, right? But an 18% budget reduction, if that were the whole story, would already be really terrible for us. And so that's number one. And then number two is that conceals a really important fact that if you look, not even all that carefully, a little bit carefully at what the governor's budget proposal does, is it calls for a 41% reduction in undesignated general fund spending, which is to say, like, basically the undesignated general fund is kind of the big pot of money that the state spends from. And you can think about that as like the state's checking account, right? So basically the state is going to send us 41% less money to do the things that we do at the University of Alaska. That reduction is partially masked by budgetary increases in two areas that the Dunleavy administration, that the governor's office doesn't control, right? So one of them is, in the budgetary documents, somewhat euphemistically referred to as designated general funding. And that's a term that we use in the state of Alaska to refer to money that comes in and is already allocated as it comes into other things. And the big one here is, can anybody guess what money comes into the university system that's already designated for university use? Yeah, so what the budget does is it calls for a 60% increase in designated general funds. You can do the math about what that means for your tuition dollars, right? So we could experience a 60% increase in designated general funding by having like a 60% increase in student credit hours. That's possible, seems very unlikely. More likely is that we would have a substantial tuition increase, and it would have to be 60% if our numbers stayed flat. As you know, student credit hour enrollments in the University of Alaska have been declining over the last several years. So, you can play this out. You can see where I'm going with this, right? So this is all to say, like, this is really bad. Like, you can play with these numbers in a lot of different ways, but it's really bad. It's bad for us. It's really bad for you guys. And so something to be aware of. Okay, so this is scary. I mean, this is really like, there have been other times when we've gone through this. Alaskan politics are like there's this term that comes out of political science called the politics of permanent crisis, and that's like basically what we live here. Every year we're talking about some new crisis. It might be budgetary reductions. It might be something about oil taxes. It might be about the pipeline running dry. Blah 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 blah. There's always something. But this is a real one. This is really scary, and so it is important to be engaged. It's easy to get turned off from political processes, though. One of the things that we sometimes say, which isn't quite true, is that political processes are complicated. And they're not actually that complicated. These are actually fairly simple processes, but they're they're repetitive and redundant. And so it's really easy to get confused by what the nature of the budgeting process is, where we're at in the process. And if you don't understand it super well, it can seem kind of shady. So I want to talk a little bit about that. I want to talk about how the budgeting process works for the state of Alaska. And then when you're thinking about legislative action, I want to touch base on who to talk to, who has influence in this process, how to find those people, how to contact them, and then a little bit, and I have number 3 on the agenda, and that's not my bailiwick here, that's for these guys, but I'll touch base on that a little bit if we have time. All right, so let me move into this. There are basically 3 kinds of actors, 3 kinds of institutions that participate in the government budget making process. The first one is the executive branch, specifically through the office of the governor, although, the state of Alaska, when you think about the state government, right, take aside the legislature, take aside the court system, think about what the state of Alaska is like, right? You might be thinking the state government of the state of Alaska, state government. You might be thinking Department of Transportation, University of Alaska, Department of Education. These things all sit, almost without exception, inside of the executive branch, right? So it's the governor's job. The governor is the head of the executive branch, and the governor's job is to operate all of those executive branch agencies. In the University of Alaska's case, it's a little weird because there's this sort of intermediary, the Board of Regents, that sits in between the governor and the university system itself. But in general, the university is treated like an executive branch agency for budgeting purposes. And UA is a big state government agency. It's the 3rd largest state government agency after only the Department of Health and Social Services and the Department of Education, right? It makes up something like 1/3 of the state's budget. It's a big deal. And so the budget proposal that goes to the legislature comes out of the University of Alaska and also all of the other executive branch agencies, Department of Fish and Game, Department of Transportation, Department of Education. And people who work in those agencies put together a budget proposal and send that to the governor, and the governor kind of takes that stuff and wraps it all together and adds some things, takes some things out, in this case sort of chucks it in the trash and starts again, and then basically submits a budget proposal to the legislature, right? And so the governor's budget proposal traditionally goes to the legislature in the late fall. In this case, because we have an election and a new governor in November, it just came out. That story is a little bit more complicated. But the budget proposal is formulated by the governor's office for the entire executive branch, and then it's submitted to the legislature, and it's treated just like any other piece of legislation, right? So the budget is a bill that becomes a law. You guys all know this story, right? I'm just a bill, right? And so this process is basically identical to the process that any other piece of legislation would follow to become a law, with one prominent exception, which is that this is one bill. There's actually 3 budget bills, maybe 4, but I'm not going to talk about that too much. But the operating budget is one bill that goes through the same legislative process that every other piece of legislation goes through. And the only difference between the budget and legislation that might, do some other random thing, right? Think of a thing. The only difference between that thing that you're thinking of, that I can't think of at the moment, and the budget process is that we have to pass a budget. It's constitutionally mandated, right? So there is a requirement that the only thing that the legislature needs to do every year is to pass budgeting bills for the state of Alaska. And so usually when we talk about legislation, we're talking about the very really overwhelming likelihood that any policy proposal that gets started in the legislative process is not going to become law, right? Like most bills, over 90% of pieces of legislation suggested just don't go anywhere. They die in committee, they die on the floor, they're never voted on. Maybe they're voted on by one house but not the other one. This is a slightly, well, as I say, it's not a complicated process, but there's a lot of pieces to it, right? And each one of these pieces is a piece that's designed to stop legislation. We have a constitution in the state of Alaska that was modeled after the U.S. federal constitution. And the U.S. federal constitution was explicitly designed. It designed this process explicitly to make it difficult for legislation to pass, right? For things to become laws. The founders were suspicious of the idea that we could easily change things. And so they tried to set up a process that is redundant and it's repetitive and it's complicated in the sense that it has a lot of different pieces in it. So I want to talk through this. This is a terrible graphic. I realize that. It's like this is a good time, for you to fall asleep, except that this stuff is so important. It's like when you talk about the legislative process, that's bad. And then when you talk about the budgeting process, that's bad. And then you throw legislative budgeting times legislative process together, and it's like, you eliminate your need for Valium or whatever. But so bear with me. Like this is all again fairly simple, but there's a lot of pieces. Go ahead, Saul. Yeah.
Real quick, before you get into that, can you talk about just real quickly, like, why this is so crazy at this moment, and how this budget? I mean, you talk about Donna. Who is Donna?
Yeah, right. Well, let me go back from Donna first.
Okay.
So that's a good question. Why is this so crazy? So Alaska is in a fiscal crisis, right? We are in a fiscal crisis. We've been in a fiscal crisis since I was hired in 2011, which is kind of hilarious. The fiscal crisis looks like this. Everybody ready? Here we go. We have the highest per capita state government spending of any state. We have no state taxes, no income tax, no sales tax, no property tax. We have about $64 billion in savings. I mean, terrible, right? The sky is falling. It's crazy. Everything's, and so I gotta tell you, I'm getting warm here. I'm like, so the point is that we have, this is a difficult place for our politicians to be in, because we've been so lucky for so long. Alaska is a state that has these phenomenal oil and gas resources that have, in most years, since the late 1970s, paid for over 90% of our state government expenditures, right? When you've got tons of oil and you use the money that comes out of that oil fairly wisely, and we can and should make fun of politicians, but in general, the state of Alaska has managed its mineral resources and the money that's come out of those mineral resources much better than other states and other governments in comparable situations. We're like doing okay. Like $64 billion in the permanent fund, something like that right now. That is a lot of money. Our state government budget is less than $6 billion a year if you take the state's own revenue, right? So what that means is that if you just did nothing and you had no revenue, everything just ground to a halt, which, by the way, is not what's happening, and made no budgetary reductions and decided to spend our savings, which would require a constitutional amendment, but it's something that we can do, right? We would be okay for like 10 years. We could basically do what we're doing right now for like 10 years before we have to make any changes. But the rhetoric around this is we're in a crisis, and even the director of the Office of Management and Budget, who is this slightly fascinating, interesting individual named Donna Arden, who was hired out of state and has sort of made a career of traveling around to various Western and Midwestern states, being the front man for a series of draconian budget cuts in each state, and then getting fired and receiving a lucrative severance package. It sounds like a sweet deal, right? Like you can only do it 50 times, because when you get to the 50th state, then everyone in the country hates you and you have to move to like Dubai or something like that. But that's this person's career, right? And so she's been hired by the governor to put together the budget for the state of Alaska, and basically her job is to be the face of this really draconian austerity budget, which is totally unnecessary, because this year the state basically has a balanced budget because of some changes that they made last year. Some Alaskans don't like the balanced budget because it means that we don't get a $2,400 check every October. We only get like a $1,200 check per person, which, I get it's terrible, right? But there's a lot of room here for doing doing things with our state budget that don't include, destroying the University of Alaska and cutting public primary and secondary school spending by a quarter, and so on and so forth. So is that where you wanted me to go? Yeah. So the budget comes from Mike Dunleavy and Donna Arduin. It goes to the legislature, and we have a bicameral legislature, which means we have two chambers. Again, everybody knows this stuff. Every state in the country except for Nebraska has two chambers in their legislature, and the federal government has two chambers, and they're even called the same thing. We have a House of Representatives and a Senate. This sometimes confuses people, right? But the way that the legislative process works is a bill needs to go through both of these chambers, and it needs to be passed in identical form in order for it to become law. So and further, bills are complicated, right? One of the assumptions of our legislative process is that we don't want a lot of things to become law because there are a lot of bad ideas out there, and so our system is designed to have a lot of veto points, right? Where a piece of legislation is proposed. It's discussed by a group of lawmakers in an assembly called a committee. That proposal is held, killed, right, stopped, or it's changed in some way and passed on. And in the case of a budget, obviously, you can add things, you can take things out, you can increase things, and you can decrease things, right? And that's the way budgeting works. And so the process is repetitive. And the budget goes to a finance committee, which is basically the budgeting committee in each of the chambers. And then the whole state budget, is broken up into component parts. And each agency's budget, including the University of Alaska, goes to a subcommittee. And so for our purposes, when we're talking about the university system, what this means is that the House University of Alaska Finance Subcommittee considers the budget, makes changes to it, passes it on to the House Finance Committee. They then consider the budget, make changes to it. They pass it on to the floor of the House. And the House as a whole, all 40 members of our state House of Representatives, debate the budget, propose and accept changes to the budget, and then they pass it. Then it goes to the Senate, and they do the same thing. There's the same multi-stage process where there's a finance committee that passes this budget on to the University of Alaska Finance Subcommittee, and the Finance Subcommittee hears the budget. They make changes to the budget proposal that they got from the House. Then it's heard, the whole state budget is heard in the Finance Committee, and then it's heard on the floor of the Senate. Now we have a problem, right? Which is that the House passed a budget, and then the Senate changed the budget, and they changed that budget to be something probably pretty similar to what the House passed, but a little bit different, and it can't become law unless both of these chambers do something to fix it. We have to pass the budget in the same form in both chambers. So there's different ways of dealing with this problem. What Congress in Washington, D.C. likes to do is something that is colloquially known as ping pong, right? So the House would pass an amendment as a chamber, and then the Senate would, sitting maybe on the same day, even at the same time, would pass the same amendment. And they basically go back and forth and gradually reconcile all the changes in a bill. And these things might be proposed in in a block, right? A single piece of writing that takes a whole bunch of amendments, or it might be one by one. And so literally sometimes there's this, these guys do it, it goes back to the House, it goes back to the Senate, right? So hence ping pong, right? In the state of Alaska, what we like to do is something that's a little bit more efficient. It's called a conference committee. And so there'll be a couple of members of the Senate Finance Committee and a couple of members of the House Finance Committee, and they'll sit together in a joint committee, a conference committee. They'll negotiate, usually behind closed doors. They'll come up with a compromise version of the budget that's probably about halfway between what the House passed and the Senate passed. And then that budget bill will go back to both chambers, and both chambers will be allowed to vote on it, but they'll only be allowed to vote for or against it. They won't be able to make changes at that process. And then at that point, we're getting into May now, right? Then the budget will go to the governor's office in a normal year, and the governor will sign it. The governor of the state of Alaska, sorry, I'm running along here. I'll move this along. But the governor of the state of Alaska also has a really important power, which is the line item veto. So, the president has the power to veto a piece of legislation. So if we're talking about politics at the national level, the president can veto something that's been passed by Congress, And usually that means it dies. It doesn't always mean it dies because there's also a process for veto override. In the state of Alaska, the governor also has the power to eliminate individual budgetary line items, basically to strike them, or reduce them some amount. And what this means is that the governor in these budgetary negotiations and in general in policymaking is quite powerful. This is actually by design. It's something that the Constitution writers, the framers of the Constitution of the state of Alaska wanted. They wanted a powerful executive. And so what that means is that this whole process is a negotiation, right? As these committee hearings are taking place, you have negotiations between Democrats and Republicans. You have negotiations between the House and the Senate. You have negotiations between people, legislators that represent different constituencies or interest groups, and you have negotiations that are going on formally or informally between the governor's office and the legislature. And the line item veto power is an important power in the state of Alaska, and it means that that the governor is likely to get a good portion of what he or she wants. This year, there is another thing that the governor wants, which I think you all have heard about, which is the governor wants a larger permanent fund dividend, right? And you can't line item veto your way to higher expenditures. That's just not part of the deal. And so what's likely to happen as we get late into the legislative session is that legislative leaders who in general don't support the governor's budget will wind up in negotiations with the executive branch and the governor's office in particular over what the budget is going to look like, and what the leaders in our legislature are going to want are going to be higher expenditures, lower reductions, right? And what the governor is going to want is going to be a larger permanent fund dividend, and there'll be some negotiations around that. And ultimately, what we're going to be a bargaining chip in those negotiations. So that's kind of the way things go. I want to talk just real quickly, and then I'll wrap up, about knowing who is who, right? So the members of the House Finance Committee have been decided now. Like some of you have been following the drama in the Alaska State House over the last couple of months, and up until recently, we actually didn't know who was on the House Finance Committee. And unless it's changed this morning, I don't think we know who's on the University of Alaska Finance Subcommittee. But let's check. And then I can show you where to go to find out, like who your legislator is. And okay, so this is kind of small, so forgive me, but I'll tell you what's going on here. Let's see here. Can we even? There really isn't a good way to make this that much bigger, is there?
You can press Control+.
Yeah. All right. Oh.
Command, yeah.
Ah! All right, sorry guys. I'm just going to do this. That helps, right? So this is the Alaska State Legislature's website. It's akleg.gov. It's really easy to find. You can remember akleg.gov, or you can just Google, Alaska State Legislature, and as you would expect, it's the first thing that comes up. If you're from Juneau, your senator is this guy. Let's take a look.
Jesse right there.
Yeah, you're right. I'm just getting. This is your guy, and that's if you're from anywhere in Juneau. If you're this is in the Senate. If you're from downtown Juneau, your representative is Sarah Hannon, and if you're from the Valley or out the road, your representative is Andy Story. We got 3 Democrats, and what that means is that that our senator is not a member of the coalition that controls the Senate, but our representatives are members of the coalition that controls the House, and that gives them a little bit more power than they would have otherwise. But really what's important here is who is on what committee. And first of all, you can look up who's on what committee by going to your representative or senator's page. And again, this is all changing in the House because some of these committee assignments are just now being made. But there's a tab that'll show you what committees Jesse and every other senator is on. And you'll note that some of you this may be too small to read, but none of those committees is the Senate Finance Committee. and none of them is the University of Alaska Senate Finance Subcommittee. So that's like not great for us. We don't know what's going to happen in the House yet. We don't have any Juneau members of the Finance Committee. It's possible that we could wind up with members of the University of Alaska Subcommittee. But if you're interested, if you're not from Juneau and you're interested in finding out who your legislator is, there's a website that you can go to. It's this kind of cool national website called openstates.org, and you can punch in your address, and anywhere in the United States it'll tell you what your state legislators are, who your state senator is, and who your state representative is. And then you can go to the legislature website. You can go to those web pages, and you can figure out what the committee assignments of your legislators are. And if you just want to find out, for example, who's on what committee, there's actually a committee tab, and you can go to, for example, Senate Finance Committee, and it'll give you, not only will it give you the names, but it will give you the pictures of the people who serve on that committee, and you'll notice that this is an absolutely monstrous committee. 9 people? The Senate only has 20 people in it, right? So there are 9 people on the Senate Finance Committee. That's because everybody wants to be on finance, because it's where all the action happens. Again, you'll notice that none of these are our Juneau people. These people, some of them are good for us, and some of them are not so good. But in general, this is a pretty positive picture for us, actually. You can find out once you know who your legislators are. You can go and check and see if if they're on these committees, and then once you go to the web page for these individuals, that will give you data about how to call them, how to contact them by email. And in Alaska, we have very small legislative constituencies, right? So a House district is about 15,000 people. A Senate district is about 30,000 people, which is striking because, for example, in the state of Alaska, a Senate district is about 750,000 people, i.e. about as large as the entire state of Alaska in population terms, right? This means that our legislators are very accessible to us. And so if you're interested in speaking directly to them, you can meet with them. You can call them up and they'll set up an appointment for you. You can go downtown and sit down with them in the Capitol. They'll be happy to talk to you. They care because you might vote for or against them, and legislative elections are often decided by very close margins in the state of Alaska. And they also care because when you tell them what you think, that tells them something about their constituency that may reflect not just you, but other people who live in the district. That means that if you're not originally from Juneau, even if you're registered in Juneau, it might make sense to reach out to people from, from back home and, wherever. I'll leave it there. That's a good place for me to stop.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Does it help to reach out to senators from other districts or not?
It doesn't hurt. So if you contacted, if you really wanted to have an impact on the budget process, you could contact Stedman, right? And that that's not meaningless. He doesn't care about you as a constituent because you're not going to vote for or against him unless you can convince him that there's something that that's meaningful about you and your background. Maybe you're from Sitka, Matsu, wherever, and so you're contacting this person and you have family back there, and you can kind of communicate that in the communication. But more likely what's going to happen is that legislator is going to get that communication, and they're going to forward it to the person who is your legislator. The assumption here is that most people don't know exactly how this process works and may only know the name of like one person and may be kind of guessing. And so there's sort of processes that legislators and staff follow to make sure that constituent communications get to the right place. And so that's probably more likely what's going to happen.
Awesome. Any other questions for Glenn at this moment? All right. Well, thank you. And so hopefully, if this wasn't familiar to you, it's a little bit more familiar to you now, a little bit demystified, and you feel a little bit less alienated from the process. It's really empowering to go down to the Capitol and give your testimony and be part of the creative affairs of the polis, as Cornel West likes to say. And in telling your story, I know that for our next session, Dr. Powell is going to talk about do's and don'ts and give some extra good protocol. We'll sort of briefly talk about that today. But in telling your story, this is a really nice template. I don't know if Terry Tibbett developed this, but I got it from her, and it's really nice. And it's a 4-page document, it says, your personal story is yours alone. You are the expert. Telling your story to policymakers helps paint a picture of the realities of your world while educating them about the issues you care about. Be confident that no one else is the expert of your story and what you care about. Be truthful, be yourself, but also remember your limits and how much you want to share publicly. Keep it short and sweet, only a few paragraphs that can be told in 3 to 5 minutes. And here's some guidelines and an effective template. I've had members of Flying University have done this training with Terry Tibbett. Women from Haven House have done this training, and then we've gone and we've given testimony, and it's remarkable to see it work. So 3 parts. In the first part, introduce yourself, your name, residence, subjects, and purpose. This gives people a frame of reference and also lets them know if you live in their district. If you're a constituent, that's going to carry some weight. Introduce yourself, the main character, paint a brief picture of who you are, what you do for a living, if you're a student, someone who has a disability or whatnot. So, and then tell your story in 5 to 15 sentences. Emily and Ernestine will talk about that, here's strategies for telling an effective story. And then wrap it up and make sure you make your ask and address the public good. And I just gave testimony last Saturday, and I can tell you it's kind of remarkable to see the wide range of testimony. Since it's a nonpartisan event, I won't necessarily talk about what I gave testimony on, but it is interesting to see some folks who just are speaking without any data, without any evidence, just kind of a gut emotional feeling, versus people who are there with data and evidence and good strong support as that is crafted through their own storytelling device as well. And so that's the first page, and then there's a sample story here where all the key parts are broken down, and then there's a story practice sheet. And I think I'll turn it over to Emily and Ernestine now to talk about strategies for effective storytelling.
Thanks, you guys, for being here. It's very encouraging to see this much interest. I was thinking this morning, partly what feels horrible or distancing from this process is that this is a numbers conversation right now, right? This is 41%, this is 18%, and this is all of this. And numbers are abstractions, right, for us. We don't conceptualize abstractions, we don't feel about them. And part of what's a little bit scary is that you guys are reduced to abstractions, right, in this process. You are one of 30 majors. You are one of 2,000 students. You are one of 500,000 residents, right? And I think part of what's important for us to realize is that it's easy to manipulate abstractions. It's easy to ignore them. It's easy not to care about them. And that's where your power comes in, is resisting that narrative. You're not an abstraction, right? You are a person who lives in this state. You are a person who votes. You are a student. You matter. You matter to faculty. You matter to Rick Caulfield. You should matter to the governor, right? You are a person. And so part of our work is reminding the stakeholders that you are a person and you have a story, right? It's much harder for us to ignore that. If we read today that 12 people got killed in New York City, we're like, bummer, pass the cereal, right? It's kind of the reality. We don't really feel it. But if we know one of those 12 people, then we're crying all day, right? And so part of this is you saying, here's who I am, and here's my story, because it's much more difficult to dismiss that story, right? I was thinking this morning about a student that I had my first semester teaching 20 years ago. Came into my class, sat in the back, she was in her 40s, came up to me after class and burst into tears, first day. And she was like, I don't know what I'm doing here. I've been a stay-at-home mom my whole life. My husband's in the Coast Guard. I can't do this. I don't know what I'm doing here. 4 years later, she graduated with a bachelor's degree. She works for NOAA. She's an incredible person, right? And I think about her all the time, that her telling me that the first day helped me see her. And I see all my students, but I was thinking, how do I empower her? How do I help her? How do I get to know her? And I worked with her for 4 years, and she's this amazing person. And I think about her all the time because she told me her story. She walked up to me the first day and said, here's who I am, right? Which is your job. This template, I think, is super fantastic. And I would use this. I've used this myself. Couple things just really short. I think Saul's template here says introduce yourself, and this is the sort of part of the rhetorical triangle we call ethos. Who are you, right? And this is important. Give them your name, tell them who you are, right? I live in Douglas. I'm a professor at the University of Alaska. I have 3 super adorable children. I've lived here for 23 years. This is who I am, right? You establish yourself as a stakeholder. And you guys have to take ownership over that. I am a biology student. I'm in my 2nd year. I am part of these clubs on campus. I do this for volunteer work. Here's who I am, right? And that helps establish why they should listen to you. And they should listen to you, but it helps establish that. So own that, right? Don't be afraid of saying, this is who I am, this is my name, right? And then in terms of telling your story, what you want is a single story that's memorable. You can't tell us everything, right? Not until you publish your novel and we all read it. You have to pick a single story, right? Because these do get read pretty quickly, but it's the stories that lodge in our memories, right? And these guys are people. They're in these committee rooms. It's a guy sitting there, right? And you are gonna tell a story that's gonna lodge in some guy's brain, and it's gonna be harder for him to line you out, right? So it's helpful if you guys think of a single story you can tell about your life at UA, right? It can be the first time you stepped on a glacier for your research. It can be the first time you got an A in an English paper in your first year, right? It can be the first time you passed a math test. Doesn't have to be a massive life victory, but some moment that was really significant to you, okay? A moment with a faculty member, a moment with someone in housing that was really important to you, right? Think of one thing, right? What you want to do is tell that story with a lot of detail, a lot of specificity, okay? Put me in that moment with you. If you can remember, right? Who said what happened, how did you feel, how did you come to that place, what did you do with it, right? Don't be afraid of giving us a real detail. Try to stay away from vague generalities, okay? It was a good moment for me. It's not a great sentence, right? But this is the moment that I was sitting in Jill Dumestel's office and I finally figured out math. Awesome, right? Be super specific. Don't use bad language, but be really specific, okay? So what I do is I give myself as much space as I want. I write down everything I can remember, everything, okay? This is a draft, just write it all. Then you can go back and kind of cut it to this kind of 5 to 15 sentences. But pick your key moments. One of our mistakes is often thinking, I need to overview this. That's not what you want to do, because overviews are really vague, right? You need to give us a really, really precise details here, and as much detail as you possibly can. Using images, using dialogue, get us into that particular moment if you can. 2 things that I would also caution you about: try to avoid abstractions and generalities. Don't use words like education and belief. You guys have been to speeches, everybody uses those words, right? They're gonna hear those words. What they don't hear is your story. Don't overgeneralize about anything. This is my name, this is my story. And then the English teacher and me coming out, brace yourselves, be really grammatically correct, because it kills your ethos if you're not, right? If you have a ton of spelling errors, they're like, whatever. It's just, everybody does that. The Writing Center would be happy to look at whatever you produce. I will, Ernestine will, anybody, any faculty member on this campus will proofread for you and just say, can you just check this with me? Okay, over email, just be mindful of that, because you might have an incredibly powerful story, and if it's hard to read, they're not going to read it. Yeah.
For those of us who might want to take this advocacy training to people like dishwashers at their work who barely read at all, but still have a valid story to tell lawmakers, are there grammar resources out in public that they can use?
Yes, but not free ones that I know of, right?
Computer, you can use Grammarly, you can get the basic Grammarly, and then many of our computer programs have just Microsoft that help. I'd rather, as a professor, I would rather see something that had been corrected that way than nothing at all.
I mean, and Ernestine's suggestion, I think is exactly right. You're the guy,
Yeah.
right? You proofread it for him. I mean, right? We help each other as much as we can, and that's probably going to be more effective than trying to send him or her to a website. Right? Yeah. Anything to this?
Sure, I just like to tell everybody I have a story and so do you. My story is important and so is yours. I have a voice and I want to raise it, and I want you to raise your voice as well. You can be heard This is something really important. I have some tips that I'd like to share if you want one-on-one. But the most important thing is tell your story. Your story is just as important as anyone else's. So please share your story and tell people in charge of our lives what you'd like. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. Questions, specific things you guys want to get into, talk about, any of us?
I've heard from students that they're not residents of Alaska, so it's not as big of an issue for them. What would you say to non-resident students?
They're students.
They're stakeholders.
They're
Yeah.
students.
I mean, I had a student yesterday that was in my office in tears, has had an incredible journey to get here, as I think many of ours. Worked very hard, overcome some incredible obstacles. She's one of my favorite people on the planet. I mean, really, she's here and thinking, I have overcome all these hurdles and now some guy's gonna take it away from me. If she's in this room or online or taking even a single online class, she's a stakeholder, right? And I think it's easy to think I don't count, because you said, my story's not important, my voice isn't heard, but if every single UA student wrote one paragraph, that'd be really powerful.
One of the things that the legislature cares about is economy, right? And so one way of framing this is for students to talk about the fact that they are, even though not maybe registered Alaska voters or residents legally of the state of Alaska, living in Alaska, they're participating in the economy. Maybe they plan to stay, and so that's meaningful. And one of the really strong arguments against this budget proposal is that ultimately it will lead young people who are the most productive members of our economy. I mean, in Alaska, but in every state, in every economy, to go elsewhere to live and work. And so, yeah.
Issues of brain drain and stuff like that.
Exactly.
Yeah, and this since Emily brought up ethos, I'm a little allergic sometimes to Aristotle, but he talks about effective rhetoric contains ethos, pathos, and logos, right? And I hope everybody knows these terms. If not, ethos is one's credibility. So having a grammatically correct testimony lends to your credibility. Being a student helps build your ethos. Your story, your community that you're rooted from, all that helps build your ethos. Pathos is that emotional appeal, right, which is very important to have as well. And then logos is the logic, and I think this is the area where you pull from the data, you pull from the evidence, you go to the more effective budget numbers and these things, and of course, telling your own story as well. And I think this template, if you write it up, is good for emailing. It's good for a script for if you call the office of your legislators, and it's good to read directly from if you're in person giving testimony. Right. So this template can help in all. Yeah, Ernestine.
And I just realized it's also might be good for an elevator speech, and we have a professor right here who wishes he would have had it ready when he passed a red raincoat. Would you real quickly let us know about that, Kevin?
Well, I just ran into WB on the street, and I think the thing to remember, it's worth going onto these websites and getting faces for names, because it's a small town, and people are at Costco, people are at Fred Meyer, people are walking down the street in front of your neighborhood, and if you recognize them, and talk to them when they're least expecting it, I think it's, I don't know, I mean, I'd be curious what people think about that, but I feel like these elected officials especially, it's their responsibility to respond to you if you run into them in the street, and I think it's worth having 15 seconds. This is what I would say if I ran into WB again.
Yeah.
So let's get busy and write our stories.
Yeah.
Get started, and then you're more likely to finish it.
That's right. That's right. What's that?
Almost infinitely more likely.
Right. Yes. So I feel like I had something to say. Oh, real quick. do you have any idea when is the best time to talk? You told us about who to talk to. Do you have dates that people can start putting on their radar and their calendar?
No, and we don't know yet. But you know, a good thing. Let me just throw this up again. Saul has been talking about you know, giving testimony, and there are a number of different ways to do that. Contacting your individual legislators or you know, members of the legislature is something that you can do at any time. And there's strong political science research that suggests that that kind of communication makes a difference in terms of the way that they act, and it's possible that those communications will have more impact closer to the time when these decisions are being made, right, in these individual committees or on the floor of each of the two legislative chambers. But in general, it's better to do it too early than too late. And so, you know, communicating individually with legislators is something that you can do at any time, and of course I would strongly recommend. There are also, in each of these committees, in each of these stages of the legislative process, there will be time set up for formal testimony, right, where individuals can go to a legislative committee room, the House or Senate Finance Committee room in the Capitol building downtown, and get in front of a microphone and communicate directly to legislators, or other times when people can call in and testify to the committee by phone. And you know, in doing that, there's a particular period of time. It's usually you know, it's usually a 3-minute period where individuals can testify, and those times are typically announced you know, a week or so in advance. So we don't know yet. But a good resource for this is the University of Alaska has a legislative liaison, the, let's say, Associate Vice President of Government Relations is this guy named Miles Baker, who you've probably all seen around. He's probably the best dressed employee of the University of Alaska system. And he works really hard, fights really hard for the university system. And you can subscribe to his legislative newsletter, and if anybody's interested in doing that, those things get circulated around. So Nick will send them out from student government, and they'll go out from the Coalition of Student Leaders, and the Chancellor will send them out and everything. But if you're interested in getting that directly from Miles, let me know and I can get you his email address.
Awesome, great, and yeah, we have.
I just had more questions. Keep going.
So we're going to do this again here in about 5 minutes. So if folks want to stick around, you can. If you've got friends you can bring in, definitely do that. I encourage you again to get your family involved, get your friends involved, get your community involved, and just be kind of relentless, because this is shock doctrine politics here. And there are a number of resources available to you. You know, we're a panel today, but on March 22nd, we're going to get an update on all of this, and another advocacy session with Jim Powell and Rosemary and Kevin. Colleen James is here, director of the Native and Rural Students Center. Nick Purcell right there with a leader, student government president, if you don't know him. Katie Jordan. So there's a lot of, and of course you all, right? So we can be resources for each other. So yeah, this is what we have to do.
Oh, I was just curious about calling. Is it, I don't know, I call Murkowski once a week or once every 3 days. Is that as effective with state representatives?
Oh, you mean like just calling them to let them know?
I get in my car
yeah.
and drive here and I call Murkowski every day and sort of say, hey, what's up? You know, are you thinking about this? And I don't know, I don't want to be annoying. But I mean, you know, I have my mom and then Murkowski are my favorite, so that's.
There may be a point of diminishing returns, I'll say that. But calling your legislators is useful, right? And so there's a good chance you'll call and you'll get you'll get your senator, especially your representative, on the phone. They'll pick up sometimes. If not, you may speak to a staffer. That's sometimes better, depending on the legislative office. And yeah, it's a good strategy. there is a guy in every district that's like, oh, it's that guy again, and so you don't want to be that guy. But yeah, calling is good. That's a good strategy. But like all of this applies, right? You want to be coherent. You want to be concise. You want to know what you're going to say ahead of time, and maybe it's not such a bad idea to rehearse it a little bit.
I was just going to mention that there's a Facebook group. If you're on Facebook, it's Alaskans for UA. I think it was started by some students at UAA.
Oh, yeah.
But they're sharing, great images and great videos that are shareable within your community. So.
And social media, as you guys know, is a powerful way to tell your story too, right? Any little images of you, of your life at the university, a snippet of something that happened in class today, something that happened on campus, that stuff gets shared and reshared and commented on. And as a social media presence, we are a place and a community in the story. So if you're on it, even Instagram is kind of great. Just awesome little pictures of UA can be really helpful.
All right. Katie's going to make this available online, so if you want to revisit it. Otherwise, shall we take a 5-minute break?